Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. A useful question to ask ourselves is, how do we know what we know? In philosophy, this is called epistemology, the theory of knowledge. It can be approached a number of different ways. In the Kalama Sutta, the Buddha, speaking to a group of fairly sophisticated lay people, was answering the question set by one of them, that many teachers come through here and preach different doctrines, and how do we know what to follow, what's true and what's false? And the Buddha went through a number of sources of knowledge and dismissed them as being unreliable. And it covers pretty much all the usual kind of ways we learn things, whether it's by tradition, that which has been passed down from earlier times, whether it's knowledge learned from books or from teachers. It wasn't books at that time. It would have been oral knowledge, but the same sort of idea. Whether it's by inference, or that the phrase is that which is hammered out by reason. All these things are dismissed as being unreliable. They may be valid and they may be not. We can't count on them. Often we see in the Buddha's teaching, he takes a practical approach. The Buddha's teaching is always, in the last resort, practical. It's always with the aim in mind of what will help beings to find the escape from samsaric suffering. And he said you should weigh and judge a teaching. He gives two criteria. One is whether, if this teaching is practiced, does it lead to a greater peace of mind and a rising of wholesome states, or not? Or does it lead to more confusion and the rising of unwholesome states? The other criterion is this teaching praised and promulgated by the wise? So this is important and interesting reflections that come from this sutta. We can see from the second criterion that the Buddha was not rejecting completely the idea of authority, of taking teachings on an authoritative basis, but with the idea that this is a practical measure. Like if you want to get sound advice on mechanical problems you're having with your car, you would sooner take the advice of someone who's known to be a sound professional mechanic than you would just some random persons expressing their opinion. Likewise in spiritual matters, if we hear something Ajahn Chah taught, or Ajahn Mun, Ajahn Sumedho, teachers that we hold up and respect as being wise and well established in the teaching, then we can with some confidence take their advice to heart as something meaningful and useful. And the first criterion is ultimately more important, is what fruit does it yield? If we actually practice a teaching, then what results do we get from it? There's one story in the suttas about some foolish man who ordained as a monk and then disrobed and was criticizing the Buddha and the Buddha's teachings, saying that teaching the Buddha gives is only worthwhile if you actually practice it. He wanted like a magic formula, or just to be told all the answers. Wasn't happy with actually having to practice it. So we can see this, in our meditation practice, that those of you who have been around Dharma circles for a long time, or read books, listened to talks, you'll know that there's quite a bit of variation. Different teachers will, on practical points of meditation, people have different ideas and different approaches. Sometimes you'll see outright contradictions between one person and the next, one teacher and the next. And really the only real way to judge is to try it and see. It may be that what works for one person doesn't work for another. This is one factor that's to be borne in mind. And everyone who teaches meditation, they're mostly coming from their own experience and things that have worked for them. Being around for years, they then will pick up some experience from listening to other people to broaden that. But to begin with, you always start with what you know from your own experience. I recall when I first started teaching meditation, one of the difficulties I had in teaching for the first few years was I assumed everybody was like me. And when I talked to somebody and they were expressing that they had, on the one hand, they might have great difficulties with things that I found really easy, or conversely, they might have found something really easy that I struggled with for a long time. And at first I had trouble actually believing them. How could you have trouble with that? That's ridiculous. Or how could that be so easy for you? You must be just boasting. But if you find out that people do vary quite a bit in their psychologies and their strengths and weaknesses, and you can only really find your own way by trial and error. That's part of the skill of Dhamma Vichaya, investigation of Dhammas. You try it out and see what works, and adjust as you go. And at different times, things will change for you. You'll find a different approach more helpful, and then later on, something a little different. So this is a source of knowledge in terms of practice, learning the skill of practice. And the recommendation of the Buddha is, number one, listening to authoritative guides, and number two, taking that and working with it yourself and experimenting and finding out what works and what doesn't in your own case. And then there's a more metaphysical level to the question of knowledge. How do we know what we know? What do we actually know? And this is a very tricky area. One thing to realize from the outset is that certainty is really no guide. You can be quite certain of something and be quite wrong. So that subjective feeling of certainty is not a solid guide to what's true and what isn't, what's real and what's not. The sources of knowledge was a question that was considerably argued about and thought about by philosophers both in the East and the West. It was a big question in ancient India, and it was a big question in Western philosophy as well, the sources of knowledge. Generally, I think the impression of the senses is taken as one source of knowledge, and learning, books or listening is another, and inference or logic is another. And as the Buddha said in the Kalama Sutta, none of these are absolutely reliable. They're the sort of mundane, general sources of knowledge. We learn about things through, first of all, our five physical senses. And it's easy to demonstrate that these are not either complete or reliable. They're easily fooled. But for practical purposes, they generally do good enough. You can experience the world through your senses, and this includes augmentations, artificial augmentations to the senses, like looking through a telescope or microscope is still, the five senses mechanically augmented. And most of the time it gives us practical, workable information about the world so we can navigate the world. But we can't depend on it. You know how easy it is to be fooled with the senses. Optical illusions are a good example. And also there can be deficiencies in the sense organs, or there can be confusion in the mind, and senses can be fooled. Learning from knowledge acquired secondhand from books or from listening is another source of knowledge, and it's also extremely useful. We couldn't get along without it, but it's also not 100% reliable. Things in books can be wrong, and being overly literal and uncritical in taking in knowledge is an easy way to be led astray. We generally haven't seen, in the Buddhist tradition, we haven't seen too much of this kind of excessive literalism, although it does exist. I once was giving a public talk and then had questions afterwards, and somebody was asking me questions about Satipatthana Sutta. This is the sutta the Buddha talks about the four foundations of mindfulness. And it's a very condensed and schematic kind of a text. And so because it's so concise and paradigmatic, then it's subject to a lot of interpretation. So it often raises questions. So, we were discussing different interpretations and questions about this sutta, and then I expressed my opinion that I thought that what we have in the text of this sutta is actually more like somebody's lecture notes. I imagine the Buddha had given a whole course on Satipatthana meditation over the course of many days, and somebody just preserved like the topic headings. And one of the persons at this place got really upset with me because it says in the sutta, thus the Buddha said. And he wouldn't accept that this could not be exactly what the Buddha said, is what's in the text. So this is kind of what I mean by this kind of literalism. And we see that more often in some other traditions, but it hasn't generally been too much of a problem in Buddhism, but it does. Some people seem to not be able to get past the literal level of a reading of the text. Generally, in approaching any text, if you want to get beyond a superficial level of reading of it, surface reading, it's helpful to get some idea of the provenance of the text. Well, where does it come from? How reliable of a transmission is it? Are there other versions? This is a more critical kind of a scholarly approach that can actually be sometimes quite fruitful. In study of the Buddhist suttas, one of the methods is to compare them to the Chinese agamas. This is something Bhikkhu Bodhi, who's quite brilliant linguist, in the last several years he's learned to read Chinese, and in his latest translations, in the footnotes, he often has comparisons to the agamas. The agamas are texts from Chinese translations of Sanskrit originals from early Buddhism. So they're a different, divergent tradition from the Theravada text, but from the same root. So it can be very useful to compare them. For example, where they agree, we can have good confidence that that text or passage of text is very old. It dates at least to the Second Council, before the schools started to diverge. So that takes us back to 100 years after the Buddha. Where they diverge, where the Pali and the Chinese agamas differ, we don't know which was the original, but we know that there's been some divergence in the tradition after that date. Another source of knowledge is inference or logic, like starting from some known premise, then working out in the mind implications of that. And it's also useful and has its place, but it's also not 100% reliable. The Buddha would use logical kind of discourse from time to time himself. Many of the suttas have a structural resemblance to what in Western tradition we have Socratic dialogues. This is the Socratic method, where the teacher draws out the student with questions, and it kind of makes him come to the right conclusion himself by complete series of questioning. There's a few suttas like that. The Buddha does that quite skillfully. And other times he'll make arguments based on logic or reasoning. But he was also critical of teachers whose theories were hammered out by reason. There are a number of difficulties with taking reason as a guide. One is that you have to start from some kind of premises or axioms. You have to start from somewhere. So if your axioms are wrong to begin with, anything you reason from that is going to be wrong. And the further you go, the more convoluted your argumentation and logical steps go, the more likely there is to be some sleight of hand or some mistake and invalidating anything after that. Simple example of inference is given in one of the old texts. I forget the exact source, but it's giving a passage talking about inference as a source of knowledge. And it says, for example, if you're in the country and you see smoke coming from behind a hill, you can infer there's a fire there. So this is kind of just a step. You haven't directly seen the fire, so it's not knowledge by senses, but it's knowledge by inference. Also, I think as another reason to be cautious about reason is that I think in practice, in daily life situations, we often can fool ourselves into thinking we're making decisions logically or rationally, when really we've jumped to the first sort of emotional response and then come up with reasons to justify it. Reason is sort of like a lawyer in a court of law, can be hired by either side and can come up with good arguments to justify either side. It's not always a path to the truth. I heard once that the best way to make a decision is to flip a coin. And it's not because the coin has any magical power, it's because while the coin's up in the air, you'll know what you really want. So all these kind of sources of knowledge, general sources of knowledge, they're useful and practical and they have their place, but they're limited and cannot be relied upon. And as I said, a sense of certainty is no guarantee. There is also in Buddhism, and I think in Buddhism particularly, but I think in meditation traditions generally, there's also an idea of knowledge by direct realization, that one can experience reality directly in the meditation. And this too is something we have to be careful with, because there are many experiences that can happen in meditation, and we can be mistaken in our reading of them. But I think where it really counts, where it's really effective, is in terms of Vipassana meditation. And what we're trying to do is to experience immediate reality. And this is the challenge, because it's not easy to do, because our ordinary experience of reality is layered over with so many filters, which is not always entirely a bad thing for practical mundane purposes. It helps us to navigate so we're not overwhelmed by information. We have selective filters taking in what's useful to us and what's meaningful. But when we experience anything, we go through all these filters. First of all is perception. We parse the incoming sense data into forms and shapes and give them names. And there's liking and disliking. And there's judgment that comes in. We color our experience of reality by our judgmental mind. We have prejudices against certain experiences and in favor of others. And this colors the actual experience. And concepts come in on top of everything else, and ideas and connections between things. When we're doing Vipassana meditation, what we're trying to do is to get down to the momentary experience of what is the object of consciousness at this moment. And this is like trying to get down to the bedrock level of experience, the nuts and bolts. What is the immediate experience here? Not an analysis of it, not a theory about it, not an opinion of it, not a coloration, not a comparison, but just what is this immediate experience right now? And it's really tricky to do, because the mind immediately wants to go off into this various levels of coloration and analysis and opinion and liking and disliking. We're trying to cut through all that. And it is possible to have just this simple momentary experience. And this is a direct experience or realization of reality in a moment. But it isn't like a great metaphysical level understanding. It's just a simple experience. This is what the mind is experiencing right now. So it's a subjective experience. And the mind is experiencing a sense object. It's experiencing a sound, or it's experiencing a thought form, or it's experiencing a sensation in the body, or an emotional state. But just at this moment, it's experiencing something. And knowing that is a direct knowing. And if this is practiced enough, and one gets good at it, and it becomes a continuous stream of these kind of momentary knowings, then there does emerge a kind of penetration of reality, because the individual dhammas are seen in their own nature as they actually are. This is the state of mind called Yata Bhuta Nanadasana, knowledge and vision of things as they are. And this is where wisdom or true understanding emerges from this. And it's kind of a cumulative effect. It's not like there's some great immediate flash of understanding of the cosmos, and it's like building up knowledge of reality by example after example of the phenomena that are occurring to the mind. And getting below all that kind of levels of analysis and coloration and opinion and feeling, and being present with what's here right now. And if any of that stuff happens, like mind goes into analysis, that can become the object too. And you see the object at this moment is thought formation. And we see with this kind of eye of wisdom, we see those ways in which dhammas differ from one another. And that's the discriminating wisdom. And we also see those ways in which dhammas are the same, and that's the equalizing wisdom. So we see the particularity of dhammas, and we also see the universality of dhammas. And this is the beginning of wisdom. This is a true understanding, true knowledge. And that kind of knowledge can also be a foundation for further understanding, in that when we have this kind of direct, immediate experience, then if we use the other sources of knowledge, we'll do so, they'll be enriched. If we begin with some direct penetration of reality as a foundation to build on, then if we, for example, if we read, study the suttas or the Abhidhamma, it makes sense to us, and it speaks to us, and we can put things into context, and it gives us vocabulary to talk about it, think about it. And if we think about it using logic and inference, we can at least start with sound premises. So that's also improved. And even our understanding of what we're taking in through the senses is refined. Because if we can get down to this kind of bedrock level of immediate dhammas, then we see the senses in a new way. We understand what the powers and the limitations of the senses are. The Buddha talked about his own enlightenment in terms of knowledge, gaining of knowledge, vidya. In part, this was a play on words, because he talked about the arising of the T-vidya, the three knowledges, which is a cognate word to the three Vedas. So he was contrasting the three knowledges to the three Vedas. This is the texts of the Brahmanical religion. The three knowledges in terms of the Buddha's enlightenment occurred in the 3 watches of the night. The first knowledge was the knowledge of all his past lives, going back many hundreds of thousands of aeons of time. He saw all his past existences. And he knew at such and such a time, my name was so and so, my clan was such and such, such were my pleasures, such was my pain, and then I passed from there to arise elsewhere, and there such and such was my name, and so forth. And then in the second watch of the night, he had the knowledge of the rising and falling of beings, which is a penetration of the law of karma, and he saw how beings rise and fall in the cosmos according to their deeds. And then in the final watch of the night, he had the experience of the knowledge of the extinction of the asavas, which are the root defilements. So his being was completely purified. And this was expressed as knowledge of the extinction of the asavas, vijakinasava. So it's expressed as a knowledge. He knew he was purified. He was not only purified, but he knew he was purified. So one way of seeing these 3 knowledges as a succession is the first the knowledge of the past lives is a complete penetration of his own being, a complete understanding of his own personal psychology and situation. You can't imagine like a more complete psychoanalysis, a complete recall of all your past lives up to the present moment. So everything was understood in terms of this one case example. So this was the particular knowledge. And then in the second watch of the night, this became generalized. We went beyond the particular ego-bound level of an individual, and he saw a universal law of how karma works and beings move up and down the chain of being. So this was a complete penetration of the reality of samsara. Then in the third watch of the night, he took it from the individual to the universal to transcendental. So the first two have to do only with the conditioned realm, with samsara. But in the third watch, he had the realization of nibbana, and a complete penetration of nibbana purifies the being. His being was completely purified with no defilement left. And he now transcended all that business of lives and karma and beings and realized the unconditioned. So these also can be generalized as like 3 levels of understanding or knowledge. We have to begin with ourself. You have to have some knowledge of your own being, but that's not good enough. It can't really stop there. You have to then generalize it. And it's always more important to understand general principles in specific cases. And then that's also not enough. We have to transcend that altogether and realize the unconditioned and step out of the samsaric conditioning. And that's the highest knowledge, that's the supreme knowledge, is the realization of nibbana.
And my Dhamma Kataya Sadhu Kalam Dadamase Sadhu 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 Anumodami